All right, let's talk about the situation in Ukraine at the moment. Now, it seems like a lot of negotiating is going on between the United States and Russia and the United States and Ukraine. One thing is for certain is that a lot of political games are being played here. As always, Western mainstream media is very much involved in all of this. So all the information coming out seems to be very chaotic, very distorted also, if you ask me. So no one really knows what is actually going on. So I thought it might be a good idea for me to take a look at all the countries involved, being Russia, the United States, Ukraine, and also the European countries. What are their positions in all of this? What do they want? And maybe that might give us an idea of what to expect, what we might hope for, what we think should happen, and what might be a solution to all of this. Now, before I continue, let me say two things. First of all, I was very much inspired to do this video after watching a video from the Durant, which I will link to in the description for you to go check it out if you want. I would recommend it because they usually have some very interesting things, very interesting information to give us, which I usually, for the most part, agree with. So go check it out if you want. The other thing I wanted to say is that in this video, I will probably say some things that some people might not agree with. That's okay. That's okay. It's only my opinion. But if you disagree with me, let me know in the comments. Tell me why you don't agree with me. We might discuss it further. And who knows, maybe we can learn something from each other. Now, I thought it would be a good idea to start with what this war is actually all about. And I believe it's a lot different from how it's being presented to us by Western politicians and Western mainstream media. Because the way they're presenting it to us is like Vladimir Putin woke up one morning and thought, you know what? Let's invade Ukraine, because why not? I mean, it's right there, nice country, so why not? Like it's some kind of narcissistic fool, some idiotic monster who only wants to take other countries, other people's land or something. And also what you hear a lot is that Vladimir Putin wants to re-establish the USSR and nonsense like that, because that's exactly what it is. It's absolute nonsense. It's total rubbish, if you ask me. I believe this war fundamentally is about the United States government realizing that they're slowly but surely losing their dominant position in the world. At one point, the United States had acquired a position of dominance, militarily, economically, financially, but now they're losing that position. We're seeing some other countries rising to superpower status. Of course, China is the number one superpower, challenging the number one position of the United States. But also we've been seeing the re-emergence of Russia as a superpower. We've been seeing the rise of India. We've been seeing the rise of Indonesia. Of course, the BRICS bloc entirely is a threat to US dominance and also the dominance of the G7. There are some other potential markets like Brazil, maybe even Nigeria in the future, who are also rising to the top. So the dominance of the United States is very much under pressure. Also, the dollar is very much under pressure. And it seems like the United States is now in some kind of panic mode, and they've been lashing out left and right to try to salvage their position. And I believe that one of those lashing outs is what we're seeing the result of in Ukraine. I believe it's a misconception to think that this is a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's not. It's actually a war between Russia and the United States and their allies, who have been using Ukraine as a proxy to fight Russia. Now, if you said this a year ago, you would definitely be called crazy and a conspiracy theorist. But now the United States government themselves are admitting that Ukraine is actually a proxy. I believe that the idea was to eliminate Russia as a threat to Western dominance. This has been planned for years, for decades even. European leaders were stupid enough or pressured enough, or both, to go along with this idiotic plan. And it seems like the plan was to encircle Russia. Anyone who looks at a map knowing where the West has influence will immediately see that this must have been the plan, to encircle Russia, to contain Russia, to control Russia, and ideally to break up Russia into several different smaller countries, which of course would make it that much easier to control the region, and would make it also much easier for the West to get their hands on natural resources that Russia has. That was the plan all along, I believe. Now, of course, from a Russian perspective, this was a very threatening situation. NATO had already been expanding like crazy, and NATO threatening to also expand to Ukraine, from a Russian perspective, was absolutely a bridge too far. From their perspective, as they call it, it would have been an existential threat to Russia, meaning that it would threaten the very existence of Russia as a country. So it's very understandable that Russia had to respond somehow. You could maybe argue that maybe Russia could have done something else. Personally, I don't know what they could have done, but it is very understandable that they had to respond. And the West knew this. They absolutely knew that if they were going to mess with Ukraine, Russia had to respond. So that's why I believe that they planned this all along. They wanted to lure out Russia, they wanted them to respond so that the West had an excuse to swoop in and to destroy Russia. Now, of course, the plan failed miserably. Now, 1 or 2 days ago, by the way, I saw a video where Maté explained very eloquently, in a nutshell, how NATO actually provoked Russia. I will also leave a link in the description for you to go see that video if you want. Very interesting video. But I think that that is exactly what happened. So the West provoked Russia into going to war. I think that is very important for everyone to understand. So it's not at all about Vladimir Putin waking up one morning in a bad mood, deciding to attack Ukraine out of the blue. It's not at all about that. There's absolutely more behind this. Very important to understand. Okay, now from that perspective, let's take a look at all the different positions all the countries involved have going into these possible negotiations. Let's start with Russia. Now, I believe Russia has a very strong position in this. They're in a very strong position. I mean, economically, they're absolutely fine despite all the sanctions that were put on them by the West. Also, Europe has decided to cut off gas deliveries to Europe from Russia, which, by the way, I think is one of the stupidest decisions the EU has ever made. But you know, Russia is absolutely fine. They simply pivoted their business to India and China, so they're absolutely doing fine. Also, militarily, they're basically pretty much dominating the battlefield in Ukraine. They're slowly but surely grinding down the Ukrainian army, and there's basically nothing anyone can do about that. Okay, so they're in a very strong position. Now, what does Russia want? Now, I believe that what Russia wants is pretty straightforward. They want security and stabilization on their western border. That's, I believe, is what this entire war has been about for them. They've also defined some demands, which they've been very clear about since the beginning of this war. I believe the one is, the most important one is that they will not allow Ukraine to become part of NATO or any other Western military alliance for that matter, but Ukraine must be neutral, must stay neutral. Also, Ukraine must be demilitarized. I mean, a militarized Ukraine has proven to be a threat to Russia. Russia is not going to put up with that anymore. Also, Russia wants to keep holding on to Crimea and the 4 other regions that they've annexed. They're never going to give that back to Ukraine, I believe. And also there's talk of denazification. Now, it's pretty clear that Ukraine has had a problem with neo-Nazis for quite a while, which has also penetrated the political elites, which is definitely a problem that should be addressed. And it's certainly a problem for Russia because these neo-Nazi groups are obviously ultra-nationalists who want nothing to do with Russia and Russians. These groups have also attacked and executed ethnic Russians living in the east of Ukraine, which has also contributed to why this war has actually erupted. So it's definitely a problem that should be addressed. But anyway, all of these demands come down to one thing, and that is stability to the western border of Russia. All right, now let's move on to the United States. Now, what is their position? Well, they're in a much weaker position because, well, they're basically losing the war. NATO is losing this war. Their plan has basically failed. However, the United States, of course, can still make life for Russia a little bit more difficult, especially because of all the influence they have in the area. But, you know, they're in a much weaker position. Now, what do they want? What does the United States want? Well, since they're probably not going to achieve their plan, I believe that they want to retreat. They want to retreat from Ukraine, but without losing face. That's going to be quite a challenge. I think they also partly want to retreat from Europe, or maybe entirely, I don't know, because they want to use their resources elsewhere. They have other problems on their minds. But before they retreat, they want to take with them as much as they can. So that's what we're seeing now in Ukraine. They're trying to get their hands on Ukrainian natural resources, and they want to take with them as much as they can. Also, European leaders, European political leaders have announced plans that they want Europe to rearm. So they're planning to spend billions and maybe even trillions of euros, which I think is an idiotic plan, but okay. And, you know, I just can't shake the feeling that they're at least partly doing that because the United States has ordered them to do so. Of course, I don't know, but it very much seems that way because, you know, them rearming, I mean, Europe doesn't really have an arms industry. So where do you think they get their arms from? Exactly, the United States. So this would be a major boost to the US military industrial complex. Just saying. But anyway, that's what I think the United States wants. They want to retreat and they want to take as much with them as they can. All right, let's move on to Europe. What is their position in all of this? Well, I believe that Europe is in a very, very weak position in all of this. I mean, they basically have no leverage. They have nothing to offer. Well, they do have some money still, of course, but they have no significant military force. They have no weapons industry. As mentioned, they get their weapons from the United States. They also have no natural resources. So they have basically very little to offer. So they're in a very, very weak position, if you ask me. Now, what does Europe want? Now, first of all, I believe Europe has invested especially a lot of money into Ukraine, and I think that they're looking to get some of that back. By the way, Europe has also spent some of Russia's money, you know, those frozen assets that are sitting in European banks. You know, they spend some of that. I think they need to get that resolved with Russia eventually. But also I believe that Europe is looking for some security, maybe some security guarantees or some kind of security structure. I believe that that is what Europe is after. And finally, Ukraine. Now, the position that they're in is probably the weakest of them all. I mean, they're clearly losing this war. You could argue that they've already lost this war. I mean, as I mentioned, Russia is slowly but surely progressing. And this process is only accelerating. Also, Ukraine has had some problems for quite a while with finding military personnel. They're basically running out of it. Some of you may know those videos of Ukrainian authorities forcefully grabbing young men off the streets and pushing them in vans to send them off to go fight Russians. I mean, that's terrible to see, but that's the situation. In terms of weapons, Ukraine, of course, is totally dependent on the United States. You could say also a little bit dependent on Europe, but again, as I mentioned, where does Europe get their weapons from? Exactly, the United States. I'd say the only leverage, if you can call it that, they have is that Ukraine is still needed to sign any agreement that comes up. So, for example, if, I don't know if this will happen, but let's say hypothetically that the US and Russia would come to an agreement, they would still need Ukraine to sign that agreement to make it effective. So that might be the only piece of leverage they have, but I'd say it's more of a hindrance than it is an absolute blockage. Because, I mean, Russia, of course, Russia wants an agreement, but they don't absolutely need it, because if there is no agreement, again, Russia is winning this war, they will continue to take over the entire country, and then probably they will force Ukraine another way to submit them to their terms. So yeah, also the United States also wants an agreement. because they want to get their hands on Ukraine's natural resources. They might have some other interests as well. But also the United States could say, well, if there isn't an agreement, you know what, we don't need this, let's pack our bags, we're leaving. If you, Ukraine, want to fight Russia on your own, or maybe you can ask Europe to help you, good luck to you, we're out. So bottom line is Ukraine is in a very, very weak position. But what does Ukraine want? Well, that's a tough one. I'm not really sure about that because, Zelensky, who is still considered the president by many of Ukraine, he's been making these outrageous, crazy, unrealistic demands like, yeah, we want Crimea back, or we want the 4 regions that Russia annexed back. I mean, anyone who looks at this a little bit realistically knows that that is not going to happen. Russia is never going to give them back. He's been making more of these crazy demands, and that leads me to believe that he's only playing theater. I mean, I know he's an actor, but this is political theater. And that makes him very untrustworthy in what he says, because it's so unrealistic. So I don't know what Ukraine wants. Well, I assume that Ukraine people want peace, but I don't know what the political elite wants. And this might also have something to do with the fact that since Yanukovych was expelled, Ukraine has not really had a truly democratically elected president. It was just a series of US puppet regimes, I believe. So that might also have something to do with it. So I don't know what Ukraine wants. But I do know that, Ukraine is in such a weak position. I believe they're not in a position to make a lot of demands. So there you have it. Those are the positions I believe that all the countries involved are in. But what does this mean? What would be a good solution to all of this? Now, I believe that at least theoretically, there is a pretty straightforward possible solution. And I know that it's going to be very difficult to put in practice because of all the political games, all the political things that are going on. But I'm still going to mention it because I think it's worth mentioning. First of all, I think that Ukraine should start negotiating with Russia directly. So not via the US, but directly with Russia. And I know that already causes some problems because Zelensky at one point has said that he doesn't want to negotiate with Russia. He's actually forbidden any Ukrainian from, negotiating with Russia. Later on, he walked that back a little bit, but then Russia, doesn't want to negotiate with Zelensky. They want to negotiate with Ukraine, but not with Zelensky. So there already are some problems, but still I think that Ukraine should start negotiating with Russia directly. And then, and this may sound a little bit harsh, but I believe that Ukraine should basically go along with most or maybe all of the major demands that Russia has. Meaning they should somehow ensure Russia that Ukraine is not going to join NATO ever, or any other Western military alliance for that matter. So no NATO. They can do business with whoever they want. They have they have autonomy in a way, but no military alliance. Also no military. So they need to demilitarize. Because as mentioned, a militarized Ukraine has proven to be a threat to Russia, so no military. Also, they need to agree that Russia is going to keep Crimea and the 4 regions, the other 4 regions that they've annexed. And then, of course, denazification. Well, I think that should be worked out either way. I mean, who wants neo-Nazis in their government? So that needs to be worked out anyway, I believe. So that should happen. Because I think that, as I mentioned, Ukraine is in no position to make any demand. So they basically have a choice of going along with these demands or have Russia run over their country. That's basically the choice they have to make. Again, it sounds a little bit harsh, but I believe that is the reality we're looking at. And then I believe Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and possibly the United States, and maybe some other countries as well, need to come together and work out some kind of security structure for Ukraine and also the entire region. Certainly Ukraine, because if Ukraine is not going to join NATO and is also not going to join Russia, they're pretty vulnerable on their own. So there needs to be some kind of security structure protecting Ukraine from everyone, and also a security structure for the entire region so that no one is threatened by no one, so that Europe doesn't have to feel threatened by Russia and Russia doesn't have to feel threatened by NATO, and Ukraine is threatened by no one. Now, and then of course there's also a business aspect to all of this. That might be a little bit more complicated to work out. So for example, we know that the United States has spent a lot of money, has invested a lot of money into all of this. On the other hand, we also know, or at least suspect, that they were the ones behind this entire project. So how do you work that out? Same story with Europe. They've also invested a lot of money, but they went along with this idiotic project. Also, Europe has spent some of Russia's money. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with all the sanctions that are in place right now? So, you know, there's a lot going on, very complicated, but that obviously needs to be dealt with. But more importantly, I believe, again, that Ukraine should talk directly to Russia. They should go along with all the major demands that Russia has. And then some kind of security structure needs to be worked out for the region. And I believe that's how we achieve peace and stability in the region. But anyway, that's just my opinion. If you have some other ideas, again, let me know in the comments and we could discuss it further. Okay? Thanks for watching, guys.